Keanu Reeves sat alone in his cabin in northern Montana, watching the snow fall harder than ever. The storm outside was one of the worst in decades, and the wind howled through the trees. Keanu had always found peace in these mountains, living quietly after losing his wife. But tonight, something felt different. Suddenly, a strange noise broke the sound of the storm, a soft, unexpected cry from outside. Keanu's curiosity got the better of him, and he stood up, walking toward the door, unsure of what he might find. Would this storm bring more than just snow? Keanu stood in the doorway, the cold air rushing in from the storm outside. His heart raced as he looked down, unsure of what he was seeing. There, standing on his welcome mat, was a dog. Her fur was matted and crusted with snow, her body shaking from the cold. The dog was in obvious distress, and next to her were two tiny pups, their fur wet and clinging to their small bodies. They could barely stand, their legs trembling from the freezing temperature. Keanu felt a pang of concern. Wildlife was no stranger to these mountains, but it was rare for animals to come this close to human homes, especially in such severe weather. He had lived in the wilderness long enough to know that animals usually avoided human settlements, preferring to find shelter in the wild. But this dog, this mother, was different. Her golden eyes locked onto his, filled with a desperation Keanu couldn't ignore. Her pups huddled close, their small bodies trying to find warmth in the bitter wind. Keanu's breath caught in his throat as he considered his options. The sensible part of him screamed to close the door, to keep the wild outside where it belonged. These animals were out of place, and he knew the dangers that could come with letting wild creatures inside. A mother with pups could be unpredictable. She could be desperate, scared, and possibly aggressive. But as he stood there, staring into those pleading eyes, something inside him shifted. He couldn't turn them away. Something about the situation, something about the trust in the dog's eyes, told him he had to help. He reached for the door handle, his hands shaking slightly, and slowly pulled the door open wider. The dog hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, her paws sinking into the snow-covered floor. The pups followed closely behind, their tiny bodies still struggling to keep up. The mother dog gave a soft, almost thankful sound, and Keanu's heart softened further. "Come on in," he murmured, his voice low and gentle. "But just for tonight. Let's get you warm." As soon as the dog and her pups were inside, they made their way toward the warmth of the fireplace. The pups immediately collapsed onto the rug, exhausted from the cold, their tiny bodies trembling less as they finally found a bit of comfort. Keanu closed the door behind them, sealing out the storm. The house was quiet now, save for the crackling of the fire and the soft sounds of the animals settling in. Keanu crouched down, watching the dog closely. She was smaller than he had expected, especially for a mother. Her body was thin, and her fur, though once beautiful, was now tangled and dirty from the storm. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, but there was something else too, trust. She seemed to know that, for some reason, Keanu had opened his door not just out of kindness, but because he understood her need. "You're safe now," Keanu whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and concern. "We'll figure this out together." The mother dog looked at him, her golden eyes filled with gratitude and relief, and for the first time that night, Keanu felt a warmth that wasn't just from the fire. It was the kind of warmth that comes from doing something right, even when it feels like the world outside is falling apart. As the door closed behind them, the warmth of Keanu's cabin seemed to lift the immediate chill from the dog and her pups. They were exhausted, their small bodies shaking from the cold, and they instinctively moved toward the fireplace. Keanu watched as the mother, her fur still clinging to the wet snow, nudged her pups gently with her nose, urging them closer to the fire. The pups stumbled forward, their legs wobbly, but they didn't hesitate for long before collapsing on the rug in front of the fire. The warmth seemed to soothe them instantly, their shivering slowing down. Keanu took a step back, giving them space to settle in. He had always been someone who respected wildlife, someone who understood their need for freedom and their hesitation toward humans. As a wildlife photographer, Keanu had spent years capturing the raw beauty of nature, observing animals from a distance. He had never once thought about inviting a wild animal into his home. Yet here he was, with a mother and 2 pups in his living room, seeking shelter from a brutal winter storm. The trust they showed by stepping into his cabin unsettled him, yet there was a part of him that felt deeply moved. His instinct was to respect their space, to keep his distance and let them adjust to the warmth of the fire. But the more he watched them, the more he felt a strange connection growing between them. The mother, though still tense and watchful, seemed to relax as the warmth of the room seeped into her body. She had stopped trembling, her golden eyes now focused on Keanu with an almost knowing look, as though she understood he wasn't a threat. But she didn't approach him. Instead, she settled down beside her pups, keeping a protective eye on them, her body still tense but not in a threatening way. Keanu couldn't help but admire her strength. Even in such desperate circumstances, she remained in control, guiding her pups and making sure they were safe. It was a stark reminder of the survival instincts animals had, instincts Keanu had seen countless times through his camera lens but never so closely. The longer Keanu watched, the more he realized how deeply this mother trusted him. She had no reason to. Wild animals didn't seek out human help, especially in such harsh conditions. Yet, she had come to him, knocking on his door in the middle of a snowstorm, seeking refuge in his home. It was a fragile, almost magical moment of trust that Keanu couldn't explain. As he stood there, lost in thought, he realized he needed to name them. It felt wrong to just call them the dog or the pups. They were more than just wild animals in his cabin, they had become a part of his life, even if only for a short time. He looked at the mother and smiled, thinking of how calm and graceful she was despite everything. Sarah, he whispered softly, as if it was the most natural name for her. The pups, one with a white patch on its ear, the other with darker markings around its eyes, seemed to have their own personalities too. Patch, for the one with the distinctive ear, and Bandit, for the one with the mischievous look. Sarah, Patch, Bandit, Keanu said aloud, feeling the weight of the names as they left his lips. They weren't just names for wild animals anymore, they had become a family, and Keanu felt honored to be a part of their journey, however brief it may be. The trust that had formed between them, fragile yet undeniable, was a bond that he would carry with him forever. As the storm raged outside, Keanu settled into a new routine in his cabin, now shared with Sarah and her 2 pups. The wind howled through the trees, but inside, the warmth of the fire kept them comfortable. Keanu knew he needed to take care of them, so he started by giving them food and water. He wasn't sure what they would eat, but he found some venison in his freezer and warmed it up. Sarah sniffed the meat first, unsure, then began to eat with urgency. Her pups followed her lead, their small bodies hungrily devouring the food. Keanu watched quietly, making sure they were all fed before he allowed himself to relax. Over the next few days, Sarah's condition seemed to improve. She started moving around a little more, her limp not as noticeable as it had been when she first arrived. She was still cautious, especially when Keanu moved too quickly or came too close to her pups. But there was a calmness about her, a sense of trust that seemed to grow as the days went by. The pups were more playful, their energy slowly returning. They would chase each other around the cabin, rolling over each other on the rug near the fire, their little yelps filling the air. Keanu couldn't help but smile at their antics. It was a joy to watch them, to see them begin to thrive after such a tough start. He found himself documenting their growth, capturing their moments of playfulness on camera. As a wildlife photographer, he had spent years observing animals, but this felt different. He was no longer just watching from a distance. He was living alongside them, sharing their journey. The more time he spent with them, the more he felt a deep connection forming. He saw how Sarah watched over her pups, her eyes constantly moving, always keeping them close and safe. She was a protective mother, and Keanu admired her for that. It reminded him of the love and care he had once shared with his wife, Sarah. The memory of his late wife surfaced often during those days. He thought about how she had always been the one to take care of things, always there with a smile, always making sure everyone was all right. Losing her had left a hole in his life, one that he had never quite filled. But now, with Sarah and her pups in his cabin, Keanu felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of family. It was strange, but these wild animals had given him something he hadn't realized he was missing. The stillness of his life, the loneliness that had once felt comforting, now seemed a little less so. He found himself talking to Sarah and the pups, telling them about his day, about his work, about the life he used to have. He felt silly sometimes, but it was as if, in a way, they were filling the empty spaces left behind by his wife's passing. Each day, as the storm outside began to calm, Keanu realized that he wasn't just taking care of these animals. They were helping him too, reminding him that life, even in its most unexpected forms, had a way of bringing people, or animals, together. And for the first time in a long time, Keanu felt like he wasn't as alone as he once thought. Over the next several days, Keanu found himself growing more attached to Sarah and her pups. At first, it had been a simple act of kindness, letting them in from the storm. But now, he felt something deeper, something that made his heart ache every time he thought about what would happen once the storm passed. He realized that these animals had become a part of his life in ways he hadn't expected. The cabin, once quiet and still, now felt like home, alive with the sounds of pups playing and the soft growls of Sarah as she watched over them. Keanu couldn't deny it any longer, he had grown fond of them. The pups' tiny bodies had quickly warmed up to the life inside, and their playful energy was contagious. Every time they clumsily tried to climb over furniture or chase each other around the cabin, Keanu couldn't help but smile. It was as if the storm had brought a little bit of life back into his world. Sarah, too, had become more comfortable, though she still kept her watchful eye on him. Keanu respected that, giving her the space she needed while also caring for her and the pups. As the days passed, Keanu spent hours documenting their every move. As a wildlife photographer, it felt natural to observe them from behind the lens, capturing the moments that felt like miracles. He took countless photos of the pups as they learned to climb the low couch cushions, their small paws slipping and sliding as they tried to figure out how to navigate the space. He watched as they grew more confident, taking bigger steps and exploring more of the room. Their curiosity was endless, and Keanu marveled at how quickly they adapted to their new surroundings. Sarah, too, gave him plenty to photograph. Keanu found himself amazed at how gentle she was, especially when it came to her pups. There was a softness to her that he hadn't expected, despite her wild nature. He had watched wild animals before, captured their beauty from a distance, but seeing Sarah care for her pups up close was something entirely different. She groomed them carefully, licking their fur clean, nudging them when they got too close to Keanu or tried to get into trouble. She was both fierce and gentle, a reminder of the powerful instincts that drove her every move. Keanu's camera clicked constantly, capturing these moments of bonding and tenderness. He felt like a witness to something sacred, something rare. The simple act of watching them, of seeing Sarah mother her pups and the pups begin to grow and explore, made him feel connected to something larger than himself. It was a reminder that life was full of surprises, and even in the harshest of winters, there could be warmth and love. But the more he watched, the more he realized that he was going to miss them when they eventually had to leave. The thought of them leaving filled him with a quiet sadness. It was as if they had become his family in a way he hadn't imagined. They had filled the space that his wife's absence had left, and Keanu knew that when they left, the cabin would feel empty again. Still, he told himself it was the right thing to do, to let them go when the storm passed. But for Now, he savored the moments, knowing that this unlikely family had come into his life at exactly the right time. One evening, as the storm continued to roar outside, Keanu noticed Sarah pacing around the cabin. She was restless, her golden eyes constantly shifting as she walked back and forth. Her usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a sense of unease. Keanu watched her closely, sensing that something was about to happen. Sarah stopped, then began to pace again, her body tense. That's when Keanu realized, she was about to give birth. Keanu had never been through anything like this before. He knew that wild animals, especially mothers, could be unpredictable when it came to giving birth. But he also knew that Sarah was in need of a safe and quiet place to have her pups. He quickly sprang into action, grabbing some old blankets and arranging them in a quiet corner of the room, as far from the fireplace as possible. He wanted Sarah to feel secure, undisturbed during such a vulnerable moment. Sarah glanced at him, still pacing, but seemed to trust him enough to settle into the makeshift nest. She lay down, her body still twitching with the early signs of labor, and Keanu stepped back, giving her the space she needed. Keanu wasn't sure what to do next, so he decided to call his friend Elena, a veterinarian who had helped him with wildlife issues before. He quickly dialed her number, his heart racing a little as he explained the situation. Elena listened carefully and reassured him. "Keep your distance as much as possible," she advised. "Let her do it naturally. Make sure she has enough space, and keep an eye on her, but don't intervene unless it's absolutely necessary." Keanu nodded, even though Elena couldn't see him. He knew she was right. Sarah needed her space, but Keanu couldn't help but feel a little nervous. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah's labor became more intense. Keanu stayed by her side, watching from a respectful distance as she gave soft, low sounds of distress. Her eyes never left the corner, and she moved with a grace that Keanu could only describe as instinctive. He had seen animals give birth in the wild before, but this was different. He wasn't just an observer, he was here, in the moment, with Sarah, offering her comfort in the only way he knew how. After a few hours, Sarah finally gave birth to 3 tiny kittens. They were impossibly small, their eyes still closed, their tiny bodies curled up against their mother. Sarah licked them gently, cleaning them and making sure they were warm. Keanu watched in awe, his heart swelling with amazement. Despite the rough conditions they had been through, Sarah had done it. She had brought new life into the world, and she was doing it with the quiet strength and tenderness of a mother who knew exactly what to do. As the days passed, Keanu's concerns grew. The kittens were fragile, and Sarah seemed to be doing well, but Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that they couldn't stay in his cabin forever. The thought of them becoming too dependent on him, of not being able to return to the wild, weighed heavily on him. He had always known that wildlife belonged in the wild, not in a human home. But how long could he keep them here? And when the storm passed, how would they adjust back to life outside? Keanu couldn't answer these questions yet. All he knew was that Sarah and her pups had brought something into his life he hadn't expected: hope, warmth, and the reminder that sometimes, the wild needed a little help. But he couldn't keep them forever. He just hoped that when the time came to let them go, they would be ready. A few days after Sarah gave birth, Elena, the veterinarian, finally arrived to check on the bobcat family. The storm had begun to calm, but the snow was still thick on the ground. Elena had been in touch with Keanu, offering advice over the phone, but now she was here in person to assess the situation. Keanu greeted her at the door, and they quickly made their way to the living room where Sarah and her pups were resting near the fire. The room smelled of warmth and fur, a quiet peace settling over them. Elena knelt down to examine the family. Sarah, still protective, watched carefully but didn't show any signs of aggression. She seemed to trust Elena, which Keanu found remarkable. Elena checked the kittens, making sure they were feeding properly and that Sarah was recovering well from the birth. "They're doing great," she said after a few minutes. Sarah's instincts are strong, and the pups are growing quickly. But you'll need to start preparing them for the wild soon. Keanu listened closely as Elena explained the next steps. The longer they stay here, the harder it will be for them to return to the wild. Sarah is doing a great job raising them, but they need to start getting used to the outdoors again, even if just for short periods. Keanu nodded, feeling both relief and worry. He knew Elena was right, but he had grown so attached to the little family. He didn't want to see them go, but he understood that they belonged in the wild, not in a human home. Elena suggested they build an outdoor enclosure attached to the house. This way, Sarah and her pups could gradually transition back to nature while still having the safety of the cabin nearby. Keanu was on board with the idea immediately. He had no experience building something like this, but Elena assured him it would be simple enough. We just need to make sure they have space to roam, climb, and explore, but it should be secure enough to keep them safe, Elena explained. The next day, Keanu and Elena gathered supplies. They worked together to build the enclosure, starting with a sturdy frame and fencing to keep the family inside. They added several platforms at different heights so the pups could practice climbing, just like they would in the wild. There were also logs for climbing and areas where Sarah could retreat to if she needed some peace and quiet. Keanu felt a sense of pride as they finished the structure. It was nothing fancy, but it would give Sarah and her pups the opportunity to experience the outdoors while still being close to the cabin. As they worked, Elena shared more tips on how to help the family adjust. Start by letting them spend a little time in the enclosure each day, she advised. Gradually increase the amount of time they're outside, and keep it safe until they're ready to be fully independent. Keanu felt a mix of emotions. He knew it was the right thing to do, but the thought of Sarah and her pups leaving the cabin made his heart ache. Once the enclosure was finished, Keanu introduced Sarah and the pups to their new space. Sarah hesitated at first, but when she saw the pups moving toward the open area, she followed them. It was the first step toward returning to the wild, and Keanu hoped it would help them transition smoothly. Though he knew the time was coming for them to go, he couldn't help but feel grateful for the time they had spent together. The little family had brought so much life into his home, and Keanu knew that their journey was just beginning. As spring arrived, the snow began to melt, and the weather slowly turned warmer. Keanu knew it was time. The storm was finally over, and the family of bobcats had grown strong enough to survive on their own. The pups were no longer tiny and helpless, they were growing fast, and Sarah seemed ready to return to the wild. Keanu spent the last few days preparing a release site, a place he had carefully chosen in the nearby woods. It was a rocky area with plenty of natural cover, perfect for the family to begin their new life in the wild. Keanu wasn't sure how he felt about this moment. He knew it was the right thing to do, they belonged in the wild, not in a cabin, but saying goodbye was going to be harder than he had expected. He had spent weeks caring for Sarah and her pups, watching them grow, and getting attached to them in ways he hadn't anticipated. They had filled his life with warmth and life, and now, it was time to let them go. On the morning of the release, Keanu carefully loaded the family into the transport cages. Sarah was calm but watchful, her eyes sharp and alert. The pups were more curious, fidgeting and looking around as they were placed into the cages. Keanu made sure everything was secure before driving them to the site. It was a quiet drive through the spring landscape, the roads still damp from the melting snow. Keanu didn't speak much, his thoughts focused on what was to come. He could feel a lump in his throat, his heart heavy with the thought of letting them go. When they arrived at the release site, Keanu opened the cages and stepped back, giving Sarah and her pup space. Sarah was the first to emerge. She stepped out of the cage cautiously, her body tense but strong. She immediately began to scan the area, her instincts guiding her. Keanu watched as she took in her surroundings, her golden eyes moving over the rocks and trees. The pups followed her, their movements clumsy but full of excitement. They sniffed the air and took their first steps into the wild, the place where they truly belonged. Keanu stayed quiet, watching them closely. Sarah led her family deeper into the forest, her head held high as she led the way. The pups hesitated for a moment, but they quickly followed their mother, their tiny paws leaving prints in the soft earth. Keanu felt a mix of emotions as he stood there, watching them disappear into the woods. On one hand, he was filled with joy, knowing that they were free and returning to their natural home. But on the other hand, there was a deep sense of loss. He had grown so fond of them, and now they were leaving. As Sarah and her pups vanished into the forest, Keanu felt a tear slip down his cheek. He smiled through it, though, because he knew it was the right thing to do. They had been his family for a short while, and he would always remember the time they spent together. The connection they had shared was special, and even though they were leaving, a part of them would stay with him forever. Keanu turned away, his heart heavy but content. He had given them a chance, and now it was time for them to thrive on their own. The wild was their home, and they were ready. As he made his way back to the cabin, Keanu couldn't help but feel grateful. In the end, Sarah and her pups had taught him something he hadn't known he needed, the importance of trust, and the beauty of letting go. After the release of Sarah and her pups, Keanu spent a lot of time reflecting on the extraordinary experience. What had started as an unexpected encounter had turned into something that changed him in ways he hadn't imagined. The time he had spent with Sarah and her pups had taught him valuable lessons about trust, survival, and the connections that can form even between species that are not meant to coexist. He had opened his door to the unknown, and in doing so, he had found something deeper, a sense of purpose, a sense of connection that he hadn't felt in years. Keanu had always been a man who preferred solitude, finding peace in the quiet of nature and the distance between himself and others. But the Bobcat family had changed that. They had brought life into his cabin and into his heart. He had cared for them, watched them grow, and even found himself emotionally attached to them. Their trust in him had been a gift, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Keanu realized that sometimes the most meaningful connections come when you least expect them, when you open yourself up to something beyond your control. His view of the world had shifted. He no longer saw nature and wildlife simply through the lens of his camera. He now saw it with a deeper understanding, a recognition of the fragile and beautiful relationships that exist between all living beings. The experience had opened his eyes to the true power of connection, how a simple act of kindness can change everything. And, in turn, how the wild can teach humans lessons about survival, resilience, and trust. Keanu continued his work as a wildlife photographer, but now his photographs told a different kind of story. His camera was no longer just a tool to capture the beauty of nature, it had become a way to document the deeper connections that exist in the natural world. He spent hours in the forest, taking photos of the animals that had always been his subjects, but now he saw them through a new lens. His work was more than just capturing images, it was about telling stories of survival, trust, and the unseen bonds that tie all creatures together. Though Sarah and her pups were no longer with him, their memory lived on in his work. He had captured their journey in the photographs he took during their time together, and those photos would always be a part of him. Whenever he looked at them, he was reminded of the lesson they had taught him, that sometimes the greatest connections are the ones that cross boundaries, whether those boundaries are between species or between people. In the years that followed, Keanu often thought about Sarah and her pups. He never saw them again, but sometimes, when he was out in the wild, he would catch a glimpse of something familiar, a flicker of golden eyes or the sound of a soft chirp in the distance. Whether it was truly them or just a memory, Keanu couldn't be sure. But he knew that, in some way, they were still with him. The bond they had shared would never fade. It had left an imprint on his heart, and that was something no amount of time or distance could take away.